The Alberta recovery model is built on the belief that recovery is not only possible, it is a deeply personal transformative process that thrives in a supportive, community-centred environment. It prioritises dignity, choice and long-term healing. Today, we honour that model by coming together to strengthen the bridges between lived experience, professional expertise and care. And it is within this spirit that we are so deeply honoured to welcome a figure whose life work has profoundly influenced our field and our recovery community model that we run here in Alberta, Dr. George de Leon. Dr. de Leon, there's more. Dr. de Leon, George, is a global authority on therapeutic communities and the addiction recovery field. Through his decades of research, practice and advocacy, he has helped shape the very values and approaches we hold dear within Alberta's model. His contributions have elevated the role of community, structure and personal accountability in recovery and have inspired countless programs and practitioners worldwide. To have him with us today is not only a privilege, it is meaningful recognition of the work being done across Alberta to build a system of care that truly reflects the heart of recovery. On behalf of the entire team at Lakeview, at RSG and the Recovery Training Institute of Alberta, and all of us in this room committed to advancing recovery practices across the province, please join me in offering a huge, enthusiastic, warm welcome to our keynote speaker, Dr. George de Leon.
Look, I want to begin this as a kind of a mild apology. Well, thank you for the applause. That helps. And the apology is this: I slept about 5 hours last night, but I don't want the apology for that. I'm just giving you the right setup so you know who I am on this. And one of the things that kept me awake was this meeting. And so I won't take a lot of our time, but I always feel the need to really tell you who I am and where I am and what I'm experiencing at the moment, so that it'll affect what I say and what you hear. So the question about this meeting was, how can I essentially address a group that is a diverse group, but all investing in one way or another in the whole idea, the whole magical idea of it developing recovery communities, those two words. And this is not a poem, this is what I was thinking about and mulling about and obsessing about before I could even sleep well enough, or at least woke me up from the sleep. So the key, we're not even near that slide yet, but I can say, I'm still in a long apology, so you gotta understand. And so, but it is relevant to the actual talk and the points that we have to make, because where I came out on it was to try to get maybe 2 or 3 really relevant, what I believe is relevant messages to you. I don't know who you are, and I don't know the real diversity here, what you know about recovery, addiction, or outcomes, or such things as recovery communities. Those are very wonderful words. But believe it or not, now I'm going into the formal talk. The first message is, I wanted to decide that you needed to hear, at least from me, for whatever it's worth, you needed to hear a kind of important history to the work that you're trying to launch for yourselves. And that history includes the word recovery, but it really has preceding words. It has the words like treatment and addiction, not recovery, and you'll hear why. And that in that history, I'm saying these folks are going to have to hear what therapeutic communities, in particular, as a phenomenon which began around 1960, as a phenomenon, what it has, in fact, where its relevance is today, and what is its relationship to what you're doing now or launching for yourselves in your life work. That if you didn't hear this, then I'm essentially not fulfilling my obligation to you and to my own professional sense and career. And I realize while recovery, this is a new endeavor, launching recovery communities, we know that has been a gradual bequeathment from 30 years or 40 years of research and experience. And I don't want you to lose that. I want you to at least have that. You can decide after you have it to reject it, use it or not use it. But I'm here in Canada because I'm saying this is an evolutionary step that's going forward. They're using the term recovery community. That's been around for a while. I make this point historically. We often didn't use the word recovery early on in therapeutic community history, but in fact, recovery is important because it already makes a distinction which is something beyond, let's say, the word abstinence. When we talk about recovery, is different from abstinence. Oh, they're inclusive though. So they need to hear what do we really know about the whole recovery phenomenon that goes back to day one in addiction. What did we learn? And of course, I can get a little arrogant because you run out of time in life. You got to get a little arrogance if you're going to have. And the issue is, so the first message is to hear the contribution, which is my bias, the contribution of the therapeutic community as one approach in the early days to substance abuse addiction. We're having a problem?
No, keep going, George.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I want them looking at me, not at you, so okay. So I wanted you to hear the phenomenal contribution of therapeutic communities to the whole concept of recovery. And watch this, the whole concept of recovery community. When you use those two words, those are very important telegraphic words. Recovery means something, and we got to decide what that really means. And then the word community, which seems familiar, but can be elusive in terms of its real ingredients. Well, the TCs were the first, I've always argued, the first real treatment approach. It was a treatment approach when it finally launched itself to actually focus on recovery. 1959, there was a famous phrase, you probably can finish it. Once a junkie, always a junkie. In case you haven't heard that phrase, folks, that's what we knew about addiction, particularly opiate addiction, in 1960. There were no successful treatments for opiate addiction. Best you could do is humanistic detoxifications in some hospitals. And within 90 days or 30 days, you had maybe 80% relapse rates when they left the hospital. I was around then. I was a little younger. I was around then. And we all knew that. And that statement was something that was introjected by the clients themselves. This is the really sad and terrible effects when we finally talk about phrases like, you can't change. Once a junkie, always a junkie. And that's what they fulfilled, those prophecies. That began to think about that themselves. And that's, even today, in active addicts, as clinicians, as observers, you really have to ask yourself when you're dealing with somebody, how much have they introjected their lifestyle, their devastated lifestyle, the constant relapses, the conscious re-entries into various 30-day, 20-day programs, how many times they've tried it. And then finally, when they say, I'm a junkie, and then hopefully they'll still be in business and try to change, but that can start to wear down. And if you're a street addict or if you're a person that comes out of disadvantage and don't really have alternative ways of even thinking about life, you got really nothing. If anything's going to change for you, it's going to be really an entire habilitation, not a rehabilitation, which we have now a lot of, and we'll make that distinction during the talk. So what you need to know is my first message, and I hope you walk away with it. You can take it or leave it after you consider it, but I hope it's clear for you. And that is that if we're talking about launching a recovery community as a major public health effort, which I'm so excited about and relieved about, that's one of the reasons I've really come here, then I want to make sure at least you hear what I have to say, and then we'll go from there. That recovery community has to really understand what has happened, and the best way is to maybe take you through a little bit the actual therapeutic community, because it's the modality or the treatment approach when it launched itself, which incidentally was launched by the recovering addicts themselves. That did not come out of medicine, it did not come out of mental health, it did not come out of social psychology. It came out of essentially devastated people walking out of, let's say, Morris Bernstein Hospital in New York is one example of that, and where 7 addicts decided to pool their welfare checks and go up to the west side of New York and renovate a tenement and live together because they knew it was too unsafe in the street in the world. They said, we don't want to use again. The system can't help us. Public health can't help us. All they did is they detoxified us. Now we're ready to go again. And they began to renovate that tenement and start to set up daily rules for how to keep themselves clean, how not to get too depressed, not to get violent, essentially keep themselves on track. That was one example. It's a true story. That's the origins of Phoenix House in New York, which I was identified with, and I'll give you that part of the story in a moment. But those were the typical beginnings of all of the first generation of TCs. Of course, they start with a place called Synanon in California, which started the same way with a recovering alcoholic, and essentially established the fact that, hey, there were no doctors in there and no lawyers in there and no teachers in there, except for those who wanted to visit and even wanted to live in the community. So the issue that you need here right away when you're thinking, I'm in the recovery business, you got to realize that did not come from public health. It didn't come from academic mental health or medicine. But that's where recovery was first really discovered and demonstrated. Now, the AA people understood years back before that if they continued to meet in groups and talked and walked in certain ways and bought into certain concepts, they'd help them. That's how the early alcoholics had discovered it. And of course, they have similarities to all recovery processes. But think about that if you're now in the recovery business, or you want to launch something that is very important to launch, you got to realize, well, wait a minute. Really, the only evidence of recovery we have is from efforts. The major efforts have been things like AA, and major efforts have been things like therapeutic communities, even though they were often criticized and misunderstood and misperceived. But that's where we saw recovery. And you'll see a point that I'll make in a few moments, that the people who graduated from therapeutic communities and those who had AA or recovery experiences became really the first labor force in the United States to deal with the drug abuse problem. That's by way of an introductory message that I want you to hear. I hope if you need clarity on that, I'll even take a question right now, but often we want to reserve time for that, but I don't want you to forget your questions if they're important. The second point about this, in terms of this audience, remember, I'm still talking about my apology, but we're into the lecture. But the second point really, it has to do with, this is a diverse group. It's a tremendous project that's being proposed. Why I call it that is because we've never really seen it. I mean, there have been excited efforts in England, for example, in terms of getting recovery oriented. That is, that it can happen. People really can change. And of course, as I just lectured to you, it was really primarily from graduates in therapeutic communities, AA people, recovered people finally got the message out to a certain extent. And then, of course, finally, the fact that me and other colleagues in the field were able to do the research and begin to write about it, talk about it, visualize about it. Recovery is possible. It's been a labored 4 decades to get recovery on the map, that it can really happen, particularly when you had a well-intentioned medical system which wanted to manage it by medicine, which of course you want to save lives, you don't want people to die, so you try to help them that way, but that was not recovery, as the way we consider even the same argument around harm reduction. Very necessary, you don't want people to die, but it's not recovery. Recovery is a particular track in life. It all has to do with the word change, really change. And so that you're launching this and you want to have now what recovery communities, and you're a diverse group in this second message, you have to agree, we understand what recovery means, and this single lecture may not clear it all up for you, but we understand what it is, what we want to achieve, and I hope you come away with, is the second message, therapeutic communities are a fundamental example of being able to somehow generate that. And so you want to know a lot about therapeutic communities, even if you don't finally accept them. But you certainly, as educated and humanitarian professionals, you have to know a lot about it. Because they're the ones who essentially, recovered addicts, created an industry, in terms of what they did. So you got to know about that if you're really going to do the work you're going to do. And then decide, are you going to use what therapeutic communities learned and how they did it? Are you going to do it? That's another message. You're a diverse group. You may have different views about how you see this. And I don't want to hit you over the head for which way you want to go, but I want to alert you to what is the experience and what is the data to tell us what's the model that we should be looking at if we're really thinking about recovery communities. We want to create those. Do we really know what we're talking about? Well, I'm going to say that as you'll see in a moment, what I think you need to understand about moving on recovery communities, it's going to be, of course, the better, this is my bias, you're diverse, the better we come together on what we mean by recovery, the better we understand one of the major approaches that achieved those and published 4 decades of data showing the evidence supporting what they're doing, the better we know that, the closer you'll get. And in that sense, the closer you get, you are then already laying the first real planks of establishing recovery communities. You don't get communities going until you have people coming together. You yourself have to be recovery communities, which means we have an agreement on what we're doing every step of the way. We're together on every step of the way. Otherwise, do something else. That's okay. If you want to do something else, that's yours. But it's part of my second message. So I'll pause. That's the background for this. That's why we're spending a lot of time on therapeutic communities, and I hope it'll arouse enough interest in you. You're not going to get a primer course on this now. We don't have enough time. And incidentally, a little advertisement on this. There are writings, there are books. You can access that. I'm not in the sales business. I just want to make sure that we don't feel that after an hour and a half it's the end of the story. There are things you can read. And there are some, visual media stuff that's around that will make a lot of the points that I'm not kind of quickly going to go over with you here. My hope is that you'll walk out of here interested enough to try to see whether you can become knowledgeable, therapeutic community-oriented people using, maybe incorporating a major approach if it's properly done. That's the fidelity issue. If it's properly done in establishing recovery communities. So let me pause for a minute because I need a little breath, and I always have to decide which way do we want to go now. But any reaction for the moment before we go now into a little bit more? That's the second part of my apology. Now you learned what kept me up last night, these messages. And now when I look at the screen, also I'm apologizing for that. As a presenter, it's awkward for me to look away and then talking to you. I'm an eye-to-eye person usually, and I find that even strains me a bit. So I apologize to you if I'm not always looking at you and if I just use the screen as a cue card for me. So incidentally, this is borrowed from a world. I've been on a kind of world excursion over the past 2 years. And the reason I'm doing that is probably I'm afraid. I'm getting a little older and I'm afraid about, what's going to happen. I want to make sure I know what's happening now and is there anything that needs to really be done. And so part of this apology is that much of these comments I've been presenting in different venues around the world. Therapeutic communities, incidentally, are in every continent of the world. And in terms of what they're doing, and they all try to come together on the similar model. Is like running the right model across cultures and so on. And the U.S. Canadian cultures are not that different, and so you're in good shape here. So this slide is called Going Forward, and it's the same message I want to go for you. You are doing something that no one else is really trying to do in any reasonable way. And it is something that I was been hoping for, been kind of working for, which is could we set up an entire public health initiative which essentially talks about the objective of this initiative is recovery, and we not only that, we're going to try to get it to a point where we literally have in place systems in place to produce that recovery. That's a major achievement if you can do that, and it will pay off. I don't know who's here from government. I'm not worried about it. If you're in it and you'll do it, it will pay off. I'm not worried about that. The studies will support all that, and the studies, of course, have to be built into this process also. So let me go to the next. Bill, take me. This is the evolutionary arc. It's a little bit. I'm just going to talk quickly to you, and you'll tell me if I'm going too fast. Just to bring you up to date about the TC, I called it an evolutionary arc. This will get you closer to what we need to talk about, what the model is. It's been diffused worldwide. I just mentioned it to you. There's been a lot of research documenting its success. The applications of the approach to many special populations. I myself have launched modified therapeutic communities in Bellevue Hospital and methadone treatment, and women and children settings and adolescent settings. So you can bring the model and you can modify it and so on. But this is not a course in modified TCs now. We're going to talk about the fundamental model. And then, but only to let you know that it has been suitably adapted and modified for wide varieties of populations and wide varieties of settings, like prisons and hospitals and jails and villages and so on. So that's special populations and special settings. Another advertisement, I don't think you can afford this, there's a book out called Community is Method, Special Populations in Special Settings. I don't like the publisher. It was published 15 years ago. Very important book in my view, and too expensive. These elite publishers try to get rich on these books. So I never advertise. It's a book that I did, but I never advertise it. But it does exist. Community is Method, Special Populations in Special Settings. But before you leave that slide, we're talking about one of the major accomplishments over the 40 years. That's what this slide talks about. They bring you into the therapeutic community. That third bullet that's on that slide says, you don't have to look at it because it's a problem for you, but it says the emergence of a bona fide theory and method derived from the practice and the research that we carried out. The reason I have that as a bullet relates to my very first point, and one you have to remember, which is the whole approach began by the participants themselves. It was a-theoretical. They did not come in with a priori ideas. Whatever we learned, they were learning on a trial-error basis what worked every day to keep themselves physically and psychologically safe in that setting, and moving toward mutually agreed upon objectives of how they're going to deal with one another, how they're going to essentially help each other change. So there was no theory, nothing academic about it. They were just finding out what works. Now, why that's important, because it would be nothing if we can just say, well, that's ancient history. We got better and better at that. Wrong. The fact is, as they got better and better at what they were doing, that's began to really move it. And I'd like to say, or I'd like to believe in my delusional life, that I helped contribute to them getting better and better at that. Because that meant, could you now understand why you're doing what you're doing? Remember, they were coming off impulses, they were coming off intuitions, they were coming off experience. Well, that's never wrong, it's just it needs to be enunciated. You finally have to capture it. You know, say, if that's true, I hope you're with me. That's a kind of sophisticated statement that can escape an audience. The emergence of theory and method, which I've always said to residents, look, I'm not a recovered addict. I'm a psychologist, even though I had a damaged life, but that's another story. And the point is that I knew there was something very, very important going on when I saw the first Phoenix House daisies. I didn't see, simply abstinence. The first day I walked into a place called Phoenix House, who a colleague of mine asked me to come and look at. It was only up and running about 8 months, a little bit like this. They came in and walked in, and I just saw people in shirts and ties and women, and they were nicely coiffed, and people saying yes sir and no sir, how can I help? And these people 6 months ago were on the street or at the railway station or in the hospital. Said, wait a minute, this is not simply abstinence, this is transformation. What am I looking at here? And I don't see any doctors, I don't see any nurses, I don't see any psychologists, I don't see any counselors. And I'm a trained psychologist. So I looked at that turned my life around, right? So I had my transformation right there. And it's true. I don't want to over-exaggerate. It's true. I've dedicated, I've immediately partialed out a whole part of my professional career then to say I asked him, well, look, you don't need me to treat you. What's going on here is going on in the community. So you don't need me as a treater. The counselors in the room have to remember this, that in the true, valid recovery process, the counselors or the therapists are not the most important people in that. That one's a hard one because we like to think we did 4 years in medical, 5 years in medical school, 7 years there. We trained, we got talents. You're useful, don't worry about it. There's a place for you. But if you're talking about recovery and a recovery community, who should be really generating that community? It's going to be the residents. Now at this stage of the game, because we're 5 decades later, there's room for literally teaching a community how to be a community as a method. At this stage, even the residents can be sitting in this room, which I always ask for, but I realized I didn't want to burden anybody in the planning of this. I want residents to hear the same lecture. But we can reserve it for another time. They can also hear, essentially, these very comments that I'm making. So, the issue of the theory and method on this was very important to write it down, and I think people have pointed out the Red Book and so on, and I'm hoping, of course, it becomes part of your own literature. And then this last point that I made earlier at my opening remarks was that one of the real developments over several decades was the development of cadres of recovered counselors and coaches who essentially established the first real labor force. I made that statement out loud to National Institute on Drug Abuse. I said, that's your real labor force. And not even in TC. They went out in outpatient programs, and the late development of that is recovery coaches. That's one of the inheritors of that. We've had several generations of labor coming out. Most of those come out of recovery. So you got to take that data and say, what does that mean? What's the primary force in the recovery process? Looks like recovered people. It's not the only one, but it looks like that. So let me go, that's the accomplishments. For political purposes and your general education, I'll review quickly the second slide, which is the issues that TCs have had to face since their inception in 1960. I've got 4 main ones, which is funding and planned duration of treatment. Why is this a big one that I wanted you to see? Because this one you're going to have difficulty with. And I'm going to find myself repeating, which is when I summarize some of the research around this. But you see, funding and planned duration issues. TCs began to get into trouble. They started absolutely outside the margins of society. They chose to take public money and come into society. If they do that, you start to meet standards, expectations, and regulations of society, budgets, and so on. You pay a price for that. It turns out you pay a price for that. Those guys on the west side of New York, as long as they were generating their own money, which is some social enterprise at a small level, earning what they're learning, even essentially pooling their welfare checks, they were still operating as autonomous payers in this. So nobody had any regulation over what they were doing, thankfully, so that they wound up doing good things in the world. Well, what we found out and what they found out is that, you had to live in those communities like Phoenix House and like many, many other examples of this. You had to live there a long time. You had to be in that community a long time if you were really in the change business. They didn't use the word recovery. If you were in the change business. Are you still walking and talking like an addict? That was the fundamental message that was addressed in every day. That got broken down into very familiar characteristics of behaviors, attitudes, emotional management. We can easily spell out what the actual disorder was. The drugs got you here, but that's not your problem. Your problem is, this is the message they were giving each other early, the problem is, who you've been, how you've behaved. They think it's simply, I just got to stop using drugs. We say, yeah, you certainly have to stop, but that's when you stop, now it begins. Now the treatment begins. So in classical, that's why it starts to be long. Everybody thinks recovery is abstinence. Abstinence is a stage in recovery. And in some of my research, and I hope you'll read it, and there is a video on this, on 10 stages of recovery, it's a rather late stage. In other words, the issue is, abstinence, if you're looking at the whole recovery process, there's a lot that has to go on even before you get abstinence. So as part of a recovery process, when we look at it from that way, in terms of you enter, let's say, a recovery track of some sort, yes, abstinence may be a goal in that. So there's got to be a lot of work that's done to get you to that goal. In the TC, which changed the whole horse race of this, they said, you come into this place, you can't have any drugs, it's over. There are simple rules that govern that, and the reason was not to be punitive or not to overstate the threats to the community, which was really the fundamental reason. You can never accomplish anything in a community if you have a community that in some ways is faltering. So you can't have that. But the real issues around that is you can't really get down to business and change while you're using. You can't do it. First you got to stop. Well, so that right away you got a 40% dropout rate, right? Now you may not believe this, but it always comes to that even individually. If you look at your own recovery individually, for those in the room who've had that experience, you'll know when you were really in business, when some part of you was saying, it's really got to stop. And when it stops, that's when it starts to begin. You know what I mean? Then the change process starts to begin. The sooner it stops, the better. You know what I mean? You'll start to get down to business. All I'm doing is give you an informal sense of why long-term treatment, if you're in the recovery business. Are you with me so far? And hold your questions if you want to re-question that. I don't mind debating it. So the funding issues and planned durations issue, which were political, they were very excited about the fact that therapeutic communities were spontaneously appearing because those folks were building a drug treatment system for society. Trouble was that they began to impose fiscal limits. That's why I have it in this slide, the evolutionary arc of the TC, problems that the TC has had. As a result of that, planned durations of treatment gone down, and things started to modify. The overall effect, it's a whole other lecture to talk about what happened there, but you'll get the message. The fundamental difference was that once it got under the peculiar regulations, anti-recovery regulation issues that existed even in latent form in policy, but certainly in funding, who wants to fund 24 months of treatment, you understand? And they all saw it as expensive, particularly when you factor in as part of the treatment costs as a residential treatment living, which is poor math in my view, you know what I mean? That's not really the cost of treatment, that's the cost of residence. But that's another discussion for my CEO that I met a little earlier, when you talk about is treatment expensive, because it turns out when you really look at TC, the actual treatment itself, it's the least expensive treatment. But I'll come back to that in that sense. The devastating effect has been on the arc of the TC, primarily from that, but not exclusively. The reduction in planned duration of treatment already was producing a natural experiment. TCs were getting shorter. All treatment programs that got funding cuts like that had problems, but certainly TCs, which depended on long stays, 18 to 24 months in residential setting, who would pay for such a thing like that? And you see that decline in support, you saw the decline, and you begin to see decline in outcomes and so on. But worse yet, you saw declines in fidelity, which the programs began to adjust in different ways to try to survive, and they began to depart because they begin to introduce other strategies that were less expensive, that were suggested by the budgetary policies and so on. I don't want to tell that story too long, but you can see I'm still traumatized by it. And so, but when you look at the truth of it, say, well, what happened is that the treatment started to be seriously affected, but there were also in addition to the funding issue, why it went down, I've come to understand in a kind of sympathetic way. When you look at any very, let's say, phenomenon that starts up front, it can have a success of its own, an energy of its own, an energy of what I call the launch energy that can take it out, and that energy is successful. You're going to have it here. You have it at Lakeside right now. Some of that energy is there now. You got 6-month people who are raving about themselves and beginning to see all new possibilities. Well, that's wonderful energy. You go into the 5th generation of a Lakeview, you may find that energy level has changed. You know what I mean? And there's a natural phenomenon, it's another discussion, but it's an intriguing one. There's a natural phenomenon, what I call the naturalistic decline of fidelity. And that is when you transgenerationally try to move up treatment one generation after the other, particularly in experientially based treatment, which doesn't really have even a firm guideline to it, or at least a written guideline to remind you about what you're supposed to be doing, you're probably going to see erosions in fidelity everywhere, even in your own private practice, folks. If you need a little therapy on that, you can call me. This was important to recognize, and then we did produce a lot of research in therapeutic communities, and I'll review. If it's not on my next slide, I'll come back to review it. But the headline I want to make sure that you hear now, only so that I don't forget it. The main research question that we were preoccupied with for decades when TC started was documenting whether they worked. And the issue was there was no research then, anywhere. Phoenix House asked me to come in, take a look, see what's doing. I did, and I gave that part of the story, and I knew this is too important, this approach. It's going to need to be documented not only in terms of what it is, we're going to have to describe who comes here, what's the profile of these clients, and then ultimately we're going to have to report the outcomes of these. Does it work at all? If you're taking public money, you're going to have to answer that question. But before you get to answering that question, you have to answer other questions. Profiles, what's the retention rates? You have to know something about, have at least an intuition about fidelity. Do we know what we're doing and why we're doing it? And do we really have everybody in the right place doing it? That's true for any treatment. So that was the research agenda of the first few decades, and I had devoted myself to those agenda. At least we needed a methodology for doing that, even ways of describing the issues of retention and dropout and understanding that a little bit better. Since the dropout rates were high, we needed to understand why that would be true in all drug treatment. Dropout rates are quite similar, actually. TCs are even higher, but they're all high. And they're very characteristic, and we showed those curves in research, which is this typical dropout curve, and the way it declines, which is it's maximal hemorrhages in the first 30 days and comes down. That's going to turn out to be very important in your work. You need to know something about it if you're going to be an educated contributor to the project that you're doing. And you're going to need you can't only lean on the evaluators in that. They're going to have to give you the data for that, but then you're going to have to develop the strategies about how to modify it. Well, not only that, we reported, I'll give you the main headline of what came out of the 60s and 70s and 80s research. I just did it kind of quickly. We were able to show the classical retention issues, but the main one was, what did we know about outcomes? And by around early 1970s, in the early 70s, we were able to put together now a major study funded by National Institute on Drug Abuse, which basically looked at 700 people who have been through treatment, maybe 200 have been graduates of the treatment who were kind of graduates, which is different only than those who were there 24 months. The actual graduation event was a year after that. So that even your sample of graduates can erode if you only say completed the treatment, because some of them may not have come back for graduation, and so that you may not know how many graduates you have, but that's a technicality. The headline was this: we were able to show what looked like a kind of classical dose response curve. Got a 24-month treatment, And those who stayed there 1 day, 1 month, 4 months, 6 months, at periods of time we broke those categories down clinically. We thought we saw clinical changes at those points, and so it was reasonable to say categorize it that way. But it took us out to 24 months, and then finally evaluate the so-called outcomes on these. And the typical outcome measures we considered the hard behavioral ones. We were not so much interested in sophisticated psychological outcomes, and this is not a plus, but it shows you there was a limit to the research questions. And we weren't looking hard even at the psychological changes, although I did continue studies which looked at that, because the funders, everybody was only interested in crime and drugs. Health and crime. So the issue, and I agree, we call those the hard behavioral. Are you using or you're not using? Are you relapsing? And so these were hard behavioral variables to look at, and were you ever, and criminal and so on. But in your follow-up studies, if you paid attention, you got other data also. And we did get a lot of other data that we continued to publish, and we can talk about that. But you need to know the success rates were basically defined on crime and drugs. And if what the individual looked like at 1 year post-treatment, 2 years. My own studies went out 5 and 7 years. The Texas Christian studies went out 12 years in terms of those first journeys. Those are pretty long-term follow-ups in the history of any disorder. And we were able, and people couldn't believe it. We were able to find the clients. That's also, incidentally, a residual benefit of a community approach. Peers were able to recommend peers and help us find people. You know, it's just to show you what a community can really do. It can wind up being a positive participant in a follow-up study, and do something that a lot of medicine has trouble doing, which is, do we get a good enough sample? It's a little side point that you have to recognize when you're talking about recovery communities and what you're capable of. If you were there, it's a dose-response curve. It rose from almost 9%. There were a certain amount of recoveries for people who had been only there less than 2 or 3 months. No drugs. Watch the criteria. This one, I'm glad we're going to say it now, but so I'll know that it's said, and you'll understand it. What was the success? You were called success if there was no evidence of drug use through all years of follow-up. Not in the past 30 days, not in the past year, but through all years of follow-up. No evidence of criminal activity through all years of follow-up. And you had to have both. Both criteria. No crime, no drugs, all years of follow-up. Because the early clinicians, who were the residents themselves, who then become, in quotes, staff, those who became staff in those programs, no one would tolerate the idea that you were using anything at all, or you were committing any crime. It was almost a kind of a hard-line religious requirement. You were not successful. If you were shooting dope, if you had an incident of relapse, you were not successful. That's how rigid they became themselves in terms of what they, and incidentally, rigidity around recovery is a stage of recovery. That's a clinical statement, and I say it to you to tantalize your own understanding about, well, wait a minute, this, you got to be able to assess that and recognize that. You can have a recovered individual, but they may still be very high in rigidity on this. Sometimes it looks like conversion effects, it's short-term conversion effect. Well, is that a good predictor for long-term outcomes? And it turns out, no, you got to watch it. People can look great, after a short period of time, look like they made the whole scene. That looks like conversion. Well, that's good that something's happened to them, but then you got to be aware of it. But is that necessarily a good predictor of what's going to come? This is a clinical discussion. You have to have a separate ticket for that one, but we'll talk about that. And what I'm getting at is that's what led into those very rigid criteria. It ranged from something like 12%. If you're there a year, it was about 48% could be considered recovered if they survived 12 months of primary treatment. 2 years later, and the graduates, I'll go out to the graduates. I don't want to go through all the dose response, but you go out to the graduates. it was about 80%. When you go, but they were the smallest sample of the study. It was actually 100 of the 200 graduates was the sample we selected. The dropouts were like some 350, 400 dropouts. That's the ones we were really interested in terms of, even though they dropped out and were not successful by definition, did they change? And one direct way of looking at that was we did have very firm measures on what their drug histories were, how much they were using, and we had firm measures on their criminal histories and so on. And we at least were able to track, well, any change in that. You know what I mean? What did the real change look like? They didn't meet success criteria, which is that rigid, what I call that rigid religious, no drugs, you know what I mean, for years. And there's a dose response curve with that, with the dropouts. And you got a graduate dose response, and then you have to look at those dropouts who didn't get to 24 months. And you find tremendous improvements in all of them. For years, I didn't report those improvements because I too was a victim of the religious criteria, you know, saying, you know, it's either all or nothing, you know, on this. And I realized, well, wait a minute, am I hurting the field? Because every other researcher was studying different modalities and reporting data which involved improvement rates, you know what I mean, people who were improved. We didn't have in the early days of the 60s, 70s, and 80s research until we were aware of it, of this concept of improvement. Well, wait a minute, you know, something did happen to this person. And then we didn't overstate the case. It was always our graduates. And even today's program keep talking about their graduates. And that's right, keep talking about it, but don't forget the fact that the change processes should be going on all the time, and even people who may be leaving, things may be happening to them. That's not to pinch your cheek, it's just to make you aware as a professional that you don't write anybody off that they didn't get something while they were here. And it's to keep you going, keep your essentially motivation going. It's also a very good clinical assessment when you're looking at readmissions. It's very good to have people come back and examine where they've been and what they learned. So you're getting a little bit of a mini clinical lecture as I go on this, but that has to do with recovery. And then finally, there was the criticism, why I called it in the issue area here, the criticism of the TC at that point was they didn't, particularly from the classical medical academy. Well, it's not a controlled trial. The design was essentially a longitudinal observational study. It was very rigorous design. I remember I developed a lot of the methodology of it. TCU got even more rigid over that and made great contributions about measurement and so on. They were rigorous long-term outcome studies. They stood the time. My first papers on that, reporting on, let's say, criminal dropouts and showing that dose response curve, was published in JAMA without a control group. You know what I mean? And sort of past that, because they recognized, yeah, it was fairly rigid methodology, so the results are clear. So they didn't argue the result. You got the result. And so, but look, it's really not a control trial. You don't know whether it's the treatment. This is the argument around the control group. It's selection. How many in the room know that word, selection, a selection factor? Nobody, okay. So, you got it. The researchers, look, all we're saying here is they believe, this is why it was a problem for TCs all the way back, and my problem in terms of a research career. They said the findings are impressive, they're clear, and they're legitimate. They came out of the best methodology you can run on it in terms of the limits, because I also argued, get out of the control gold standard business. It's a delusion, not philosophically, because you don't run a gold standard controlled study until you run a study like this. You first show very compelling evidence that something might be related to treatment. You don't have to prove it. And in my writings, I'm getting louder now, but this you're down in my wheelhouse now. I'm getting louder on this is because I had to fight this argument with my respectful colleagues around the world on this. I'm not worried about its control study. Control study is a late form of research methodology at the right time when you can answer the right question for the right reason. We provided the data to show and I've always concluded my research by saying this dose response curve of course, is not a controlled curve, but it's certainly compelling evidence for the hypothesis that the treatment has done it. So go test the hypothesis. That's the controlled study. If you really want to test the hypothesis, go then build up some kind of control groups, and that's still a work in progress even today. So why I have it on this board, it also gives me the opportunity to keep teaching you about the TC and what the recovery community is going to have to do if it's going to get in business. And this is something we can talk about in some of our own extem conversations. But it was a problem for the TCs for several decades. It was sometimes a problem for me. I'm not complaining. I've made a good living in my life, and I've got the respect of a lot of colleagues. I'm just doing this as part of show business to make a point. But because nobody ever really disrespected, and we're well published for years. Nobody ever not published, what we were doing, including NIDA monographs, you understand, that exist. So I'm making the point, what you need to understand as educated people, and understand it through at least my lens that you're hearing from it about, and I hope it does inform you. Because if you're going to go forward, and you're doing this, you're going to build in an evaluation of what you're doing, and I want you to get a sense of what that history has been. And so you naturally going to build this in, and you're going to need help to build it in and do it the right way, and understand essentially the pluses and minuses of that and the ranges of what you can and the questions you're going to answer. But I would only keep insisting as an old timer on this, that evaluation piece, because based on this historical review that I'm giving you, tells us you want to build it in from day one. And if you build it in from day one, you'll be able to answer a lot of questions that don't interfere with the program for the moment, but will tell a lot of give us information that we're really going to need. I want you to learn to be empirically oriented. And it's ultimately the truth of the recovery process for the individual. Be empirically oriented. Can you take essentially criticism? Can you take what's true about me, what's not true about me, what do I see about myself? And in the end, the TC tries to answer the question in its mutual aid approach. You will use, and I'm going to come to the definition of community as a method in a minute. And before I get informally, here's the definition of community as method. In this therapeutic community approach, it's all about change. And we're going to teach a method, the community as a method, is the following. We're going to teach you how to use us, the rest of us, and everything we do here, groups, meetings, and so on, how to change yourself. You're going to use us, you're going to learn how to use it, you're going to learn how to use us to change yourself. Now, the reason I'm going to come back to that definition on the next slide, but I wanted to get it in fast. So, in this context of being empirical, being real, and that is that once, in fact, the individual comes to, in their own recovery process, give me the reality. What's the reality? And in TCs, if you get that far in a good group, where the individual community is giving you feedback about behaviors and attitudes that may be self-destructive or also community threatening, that may be, you got to be capable of hearing that, who you are, and you can't get there alone. You got to get there using everybody in this room to help you see that. Now I'm kind of telegraphing my next slide, but I wanted to give you a sense of how it merges with the research, even the research questions. So TCs can be very empirical. And when I used to do these early studies, and I did a lot of other studies which were also in the program, looking at psychological changes and so on, but they looked at that same dose response curves that I talked about, and I would do a seminar with the residents on the research. What did they see? What can they add to this? An interpretation, how do they see the data? Incidentally, they're very good reviewers. They know how to review, they have intuitional reviews of research. They'll give you ways of looking at your data that you have to pay attention to. I realize I might be straying a bit. It's not all a geriatric problem. It turns out to be this is how I stay interested in my own work. So I have to get some fun out of this meeting in terms of you, as well as you, hopefully. So that's why I do it. But I may pay a price in time. I gave this definition now, so I gave you the sense of the accomplishments. And so now I want to take you a little closer to what the approach actually is in a little bit more detail. So in a way, I've kind of, I hope I didn't rush it too much. I'm looking at heads to see if I get some validation or some confirmation. In terms of, okay, you have a good sense of maybe what the therapeutic community is, but now I really want to get closer. A long-term approach looks like the one that showed the most stable outcomes, generation after generation, worldwide, incidentally. Any program that called itself a therapeutic community and was operating like a Phoenix House or a Daytop, those programs produced the same results, no matter what the culture was. So that's what spirited me through all those decades. It was simply not, it's not a study in my backyard. You heard the definition. Now, you notice, I want to repeat something about this because you have to go, if you're going to consider a therapeutic community approach as a kind of primary treatment approach in developing recovery communities, if that's what you're going to do to produce recoveries, you're going to need a consensus on what the word recovery is. You heard a little bit about that. What the word community is, you'll hear a lot more about that. But then you'll also need to understand whether, as you hear these next two slides, whether you can relate to these slides, whether they have some meaning to you, because they come out of what I would call a classical therapeutic community approach. And now comes this distinction, to help you see this, between the terms therapeutic community and then, or therapeutic communities, which are actually places. They're not approaches. Therapeutic means, healing of some sort, and communities that heal. That's what that means. So you can have all kinds of communities that heal. You have religious communities that heal, you know what I mean? You have other kinds of secular communities that do things. So we need something more rigorous and more precise. To go, well, wait a minute, what are you doing in this? You're calling yourself a therapeutic community. You call yourself a therapeutic community. So you're pointing out some healing. Is that you mean what? You mean people who get healed in therapeutic communities? Or what exactly do you mean? What are you doing to heal people? And as a matter of fact, what is it, the disorder? That breaks down to basic question. What disorder are you addressing here in this program that you're now doing something to help them change that? Now, all of that was latent elements of even the original they were simply doing it intuitively and doing it off their own experience. You're now going to hear at least a brief summary of what that is when we talk now about community as method in more formal terms. That's for our communication, so you'll understand it. So that word purposive, that even though we're off the slide, I wanted you to recognize in that definition, community as method means we're going to use the community to help you change. So it's an intentional community. It has very definite objectives. Everybody can see that and probably kind of agree on that. So now we'll go into, bring us back, Bill. Thanks, Bill. What do we really mean? This is more technical language for moments. It's a little more formal than the way I've been talking with you. It's a little more informal. I've come to see, look, a good way to have people understand when a community is operating as a method, what does that mean in terms of how people will change? So you have to first look at these first 4 points. In this community, everything that you're going to get that's going to heal you, help you, change you, anything you're going to get in this community. It's not going to be a setting where you're in this community, you have some peers, you look at the television together, you do a morning meeting together, but then you go to a counselor down here, or you go outside over here, and you get 3 other evidence-based issues which are useful. They're useful. Evidence-based practices are useful. There are some that are very useful. I'll come back to that. But they're not That's not what we do here in these original TCs. They never had any evidence-based anything, and they had only themselves. And so the issue is, how do you get a method out of that? You know what I mean? You don't even have enough educated people to develop it. Well, what we're getting at here is that everything that's going to happen to you is because you're in this community and you're using every relationship and every activity. We'll teach you how to do that. We'll teach you how to use it. But it's going to be you. You're the outcome, not us. I'm repeating that over and over because it challenges traditional professionals in terms of how do we really understand doing therapy if that's going on. The community is a method when it sets the expectations. Whenever I walk into a Lakeview or any community, I try to get clear about, do they understand when the community says we're going to teach you, does the community understand what they're saying what those expectations are? Did they make it clear about what actually are the expected behaviors and attitudes that have to change, and the emotional regulation issues that have to change? Do they recognize when they say we're going to set those expectations, what they're asking of the individual? They do. When it's effective a community, it's very clear about what they want. That's why TCs could sometimes look to the outside observer as a little rigid, because this community is now making very clear about what's the expected behavior. There's a kind of right and wrong way to behave. And there's a certain way essentially to carry yourself as an emotional person. When we get a concept like hold yourself accountable, which is a TC word, a TC phrase, teaching people to hold themselves accountable, namely, I can provide the reasons for why I do and what I don't do. That's what holding accountable means. I know what I did, and here's why I did it and how I did it. A lot of people don't know that. That's the actual meaning of holding them accountable. You know, whether it's positive behaviors or negative behaviors they engage in, they've got to be ready to be able to tell people openly in a disclosing way what I did, why I did it, and how I did it. So, community sets the expectations. These are the behaviors that you need to finally work on. That'll usually come out from informal interactions. You know what I mean? You got a real problem with your anger. I don't know. You know how it's got you in trouble in your life, and it's getting you in trouble in this program. And you got to decide whether you want to work on it in this program or not. That might come out of a formal group interaction. It might come out of a series of simple dyadic interactions. But the client in the program is hearing already messages from the community about what they have to look at. You often hear that phrase, will you look at this? It's like holding a mirror up. Well, that's essentially setting expectations. Then we set expectations in formal ways. You got rules, you got regulations, cardinal rules, you got house rules. You don't have many. Classical TCs didn't have many rules, because rule-governed behavior has different outcomes than non-rule-governed behavior. If you're in the change business, you know, rule-governed behavior is prisons. And when we finally look at prisons, we all come to understand they use a lot of rule-governed behavior, but they're not in the recovery business. They're in the management business. We can't have any noise in this place. We can't have any struggle. We can't have any violence. Oh, it's true. You have to manage that. But that's the end of it in prisons, right? That's what it's all about. But in TCs, you don't need a lot of rules. If that community is strong, if they understand the method, that is why we're here and what we're supposed to be doing with each other, I only need a few rules on that. No drugs, no violence, no sexual acting out. And then finally, a leaner rule, but still quite stiff, and you have to participate. If you strain this community too much by laying back in the back of the room and don't do things, and it's now week 1, month 1, month 2, that might essentially ask the community may come back to you and say, do you still want to be here? Are you with me on this? I'm giving you a touch of this. But that's an example of the community setting expectation. Then the word assesses and responds is also a requirement of the community when it's a method. It's constantly following it. We're obligated to essentially keep assessing, looking at clients, talking to them, that is the residents, not the staff. It has nothing to do with staff, it has to do with the residents, that they're doing this. If the residents are not doing that, if they're too kind to one another, if it's all about love and fraternal and sisterly love in that, that's fine. We're glad those things are happening. But more has to happen. I got to help you pull your own covers in terms of who you are, and I can only do that by telling you how I feel about you. And that gets done in a prescribed way. You know, it's often done informally. You can do it on the side, dyadics. People talk to each other all the time. That means treatments are going on all the time. If it's going on, I always listen when I walk through a TC, what they're talking about. If they're only talking about sports, I'm a little bit worried about it, you know what I mean? But if they're talking about something about each other, I start to get a little more encouraged. So the issue of assessing the clients is both a formal way of assessing it, which is there might be a group night that finally is put together in the classical group process, which you're not yet doing and maybe don't understand enough, but some kind of an encounter process, a group, quotes, confrontational group process use. Why are they there? Because that's a formal intervention. We're going to come together now, and 3 or 4 residents are now going to talk to you in the group. Not necessarily in dangerous ways, but we're here to really now put into a little bit of more formality about how we see what you're doing and what's happening to you. That's an example of the group assessing. They're looking, and now they finally given their opportunity, and then we have a vehicle for them to hear that. And there's more vehicles. That's when we get into the fidelity of the treatment approach or the recovery-oriented approach, whether you have all the components of that system in place to do that. And then the response means the community is a method when it's responding. That is, okay, we're going to give you feedback. Usually the feedback is, it might be correctional. This has to change. We're with you in this. And then we ask you to make a new commitment to make a change and pay attention to it. Or it might be affirmative. Early TCs, unfortunately, were a little bit more corrective than affirmative. Their impulsive, and that came out of their own histories, you know what I mean? They were angry at themselves as well as angry at the world. And anybody who would seem to be threatening even their own recovery, they'd get angry with them. We had to gradually learn in TCs, in a community method, that you have to have the appropriate balance between corrective feedback and affirmative feedback, which is how well you're doing. But watch this, and here's another free clinical lesson for you. Affirmational responses are extremely important, but only if they're real. Only if they're authentic. Particularly people who've lived through substance abuse disorder, they can smell inauthenticity a mile away. We can pinch each other's cheek all day, you understand that? And if it doesn't sound right, it's not going to go right. So I had to train even traditional therapeutic communities on a basis. Now that was my clinical eye watching it and saying, you know, wait a minute, you're giving feedback, that's good, and you're giving some affirmations, but they're getting ritualized and routine. They're saying ordinary things. You came in, you were this way, you looked pretty good today, you know, and so on. Instead of, you know, wait a minute, you got to get down. If you got something good to say to somebody, make sure you know what you're telling them. Make sure you know that it's real, that you've seen it, and you can help them see it, because they haven't seen it. And if you're going to really tell them that, this is a peer talking to a peer, here's part of incidental recovery coach training in case you wanted a free lesson on this one. It better be authentic. That's why even as a coach, you can't say automatics. You got 50% power out of that, I can tell you that, at best. Everything has to have the ring of authenticity. I realize, I don't want to criticize you for that, this is not a clinical training today. We got 10 minutes? That's why you can see it's not. I'm all over the place on this. You got the point only because I got 10 minutes. Forgive me on that. So go to the next slide. I want to see if I'm missing it. I did cover some of the research. Let's go back to this issue. Another fundamental concept that is a good takeaway. Nothing works. It's not going to work here either in terms of launching either a TC or a fidelity or a recovery community without understanding fidelity. And this is, you've been hearing it in bits and pieces as we go because I've been giving you modifying examples of it. But here's what we mean. Everything that's done in the TC is based on its perspective. We know what, the various activities that the communities I just reviewed with you is all based on what we understand about the disorder, what we understand about, that is, drug addiction as a disorder, what we understand about the person, what we understand about the recovery process, and what we understand about right living. TCs, now this is my writings, but this is what I extracted from what I understood, what was working in that TC and why it worked. And I think I'm roughly right about it, because the book has had 20 years of circulation on this. So the issue is, you need to recognize, if you're in the recovery business, and TCs are one of the prime examples of producing recoveries, one of the reasons they were able to do that is they had a perspective on this, about, how you get those recoveries. How do you get them? Well, I think I know what the disorder is. I think I know something about these clients in terms of typical characteristics that display that disorder. I think I know something about how the recovery process, or the learning process, occurs. And I think I know something about how they're going to have to ultimately adapt a way of living, which we'll call right living, that they buy into, because they have lived another life, which has been a negative life. If they learn on all four domains, that perspective governs everything we're trying to teach. So what happens in that TC, if you're going to run it, is based on this. If you cannot explain why we run that morning meeting, or why we want to have an evening group, or why we have a privilege and a discipline, which are elements of the method, if you can't explain that in terms of this perspective, namely what it will do for you and what it's addressing in you, you don't know what you're doing. Everything is governed by the perspective. So if you want to get in, I'm doing this by steps. You want to get into the recovery business, I would say, and you want to look at TCs as an approach that essentially has produced those recoveries, and it has a theory about how it's produced those recoveries using the most active approach that we know, namely mutual self-help in the communal way. You have to be able to know exactly why we do what we do. And if you can't explain why we run that morning meeting, or what this group is supposed to produce, I used to do as part of the evaluations of any group, sit in the group, and then at the end of the group, ask the group, what was the objective of this group? What did we want to accomplish in this? And if you're not prepared to answer those questions, you can say, well, then you don't know what you're doing. Every resident has to really realize, what is the relevance of this activity for my changing my life? Why do I go to a morning meeting? It looks so ordinary. There's nothing inventive about a morning meeting. They have it in the military, they have it in sports. There's nothing inventive about a morning meeting. But why is it every morning, 8:30 in the morning, we're there 30 minutes, 40 minutes? Why? That looks like a social activity. Anybody want to give me a quick answer anyway, why we do the morning meeting? Go ahead.
Gratitude.
What?
We share gratitude in the morning.
I know that's what you do.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's one of the things you do.
There as a community.
He said share gratitude. That's one of the things that some TCs have done. I'm gonna kind of surprise you. That was not the original morning meeting. You're not wrong about that. That's what we do here, I understand. But to give you an idea of the sophistication of this, early TCs had nothing to do with gratitude. The morning meeting was there because I'm waiting to see if someone else will give me another reason why we run the morning meeting. Go ahead.
To bring the community together. To bring the community together.
Bring the community, but it's true, that's a morning, but we have 4 meetings in the classical TC, and each one of them has as its first objective, bring the community together. That's what we mean by a meeting. So you're right about that, to bring the community together.
Still belongs.
What?
To see who still belongs.
To what?
To see who still belongs. To identify each other.
That's another one that has to do with the word of bringing the community together. I'll take one more because I'm running out of time. Go ahead.
Motivation.
Motivation is the first word that gets close to it.
Having fun?
Having fun. The TCs recognized early that if our people don't get up in the morning ready to really get into that day and do the work of the long day, they won't survive. It had to dissipate the potential boredom. It had to dissipate the potential doubt. It had to dissipate their inclination toward mood disorder, which is both psychologically related and drug related. They had lived backwards. Their days was night, their night was day. They had to learn how to have an ordinary, normal day, hearing the radio, hearing music, singing songs. The classical TC learned, do nothing that's negative in the morning. Just get them up in the morning and get them running, dancing, talking. I don't even need poetry in the morning unless it's humor. Why do I now sound very fascistic on this? Why do I sound so rigorous? Morning meetings, not only here but anywhere, morning meetings are misused everywhere. People don't even understand and how powerful it is. But it's an example in this context of what actually is the theories say. Why do we run this? It's an expensive activity. It's every day, and it could go every which way, sideways, could go wrong. You want to look at what's the objective. I want this whole community to be lifted, which is not, they may get other things. You may, if you do gratitude, you can have some other experience. You can have some sense of being calm. Okay, I got that. I'm just illustrating the relationship between the theory and the method. It's a very simple example, and you'll forgive me that we really can't do, this is a simple, short teaching, not a training. So this is an example. Can you explain why we do a morning meeting? And if you can you assess whether you have reached the objective? Did they get to a scale of 8 or 9 on a scale of 10 in terms of feeling lifted? Once you finally get down to business, you realize everything we're doing in that morning meeting we have to redo. We've got to look at it. What are we doing in there that's not lifting people? We may have moments. You got a 2-minute moment, but the room still leaves the way it came in. So in New York, and then I'll end it. The New York version of this, to give you a sense of this, those morning meetings and those TCs, particularly the female TCs, but in those TCs, a lot of dance, a lot of music. In fact, you would enter the room like this, and you might have the music on even before they entered, so they feel they're going into entertainment. And then you can run some of the standard things. You're going to do with philosophy as a thing. There's a list in the Red Book of typical morning meeting activities, but they're short, and everybody knows that the real key to it is going to be the excitement, the rise of that. Also, it's an image-busting meeting. People who have never known how to have fun sober I'll have to learn how to do that, and morning meeting gives them an opportunity to do that. People who've never felt comfortable standing up in front of other people and doing things, they may be even looking a little silly, they have to learn how to do that because it's part of their fragility. It's a profound intervention. It's a community intervention. That means it's targeted to the community. That's why it's called a meeting, because the whole house is in there. But it's what I call one of the interventions that we use. It's using this particular meeting has an interventional outcome involved. So do I really have to stop? What's on the next?
3 minutes.
So maybe this. Okay, I want to hope that you don't feel that we've had an aborted a lecture, but this may capture it. And in terms of a real process measure, it's a little bit deeper. It's kind of a summarizing statement. In striving to meet the community expectation, individual finally buys in to what the community is asking them to do in terms of participation. In striving to meet that, residents pursue the ultimate goals of socializing, training. That will all unfold. As they make those changes, they can all be classified in terms of they're getting more socialized, they're getting more mature, they're showing psychological growth, they're getting more real. There's a whole set of words that would describe while they're absolutely meeting those expectations, they're changing. That's not the same as saying that on day 21 they say they feel great, but if you really pin residents down to that question, as I always do, I ask them things like, what are you learning? Or how have you changed? You'll always hear, they'll find something, about themselves that I guess that changed. And that's the real measure of an effective approach. They are changing, the community says they're changing, they feel that they're changing. And if you have authentic change, as small as it is, it increases the likelihood of further change. That's the true motivational dynamic. Motivation means I have a problem, I want to change, and if you get evidence of change, personal evidence of change, you then say, I'm going to continue doing what I'm doing because I am changing. It's got that kind of a summary, and the process, that's what we mean by the process. That interaction of meeting community expectations results in the change process, and that's a summarizing statement. And in this process, your role as whoever you are, but if you're some kind of a staff person, and I'm not talking about senior residents who are the real communicators and managers of the community, but if you're a staff person, sometimes overstaffed, I think most of the programs are overstaffed, not understaffed. But if you are a staff person, whatever your background is, you see something that touches you about this discussion and understanding about this approach, which I'm saying is the cornerstone of the whole recovery movement in the world, then you realize your role is a more humble but meaningful role. You're a facilitator in that. If you understand it, you can help what the community is trying to do for itself. That's what I do. I don't treat them, that's what I do. When I give them a lecture or something like that, I'm just, whatever I know as a member of this community, I'm going to share with you, and you'll take it and you'll use it. But I'm not your treater. I'm not your therapist. I'm not your counseling. Even though people ask for wise words, I understand that. The change process goes through this mystical community approach, meeting expectations of the community. So just give me a shot at the next slide just to make sure that I'm not missing a major point. Is there one more slide? Oh, this, I am. I guess this is the dollars and cents sum up.
We can touch on this after break.
You want to do this after break? Well, I'll tell you what's on this slide. Part of what's on the discussion that I want to hear. I'll try to give some closure to this in the sense that maybe you can remember it. All I've taken you through is, I hope, fundamental elements of the TC and increase your understanding of this approach. I hope you have some level of increase of understanding of this approach as one outcome. This slide in the end is now really going to get much closer to what you're actually doing here. Other things that are going on or should be going on that I'd like to see in the discussion, and Lindsay said we're going to have that after the break. Okay, I appreciate you listening on this. And I wanted to make sure that I have this last slide up and this is very brief, because I want to make sure we all understand at least three concepts that I hope will drive the process forward, and in terms of what you're trying to do in creating recovery community. And I hope it unifies some of the concepts and discussion you've been hearing today. One, this idea that there are wide differences I mentioned earlier, in people who claim they're running therapeutic communities, and there are, and over the years that's always been true. The classical model that I've been talking to you about, which is the long-term model, which actually uses their actual approach as community as method, is different from any setting that might simply call itself a therapeutic community. But we can classify those, and I did over the years, and even published that. There is this standard model that we talked about. Then there are modified TCs that not only include community as method, but moderated for a special population or a special setting. That's a sophisticated discussion in its own right. And then there are programs that just borrow some TC elements, and there's nothing wrong with that, but you can't expect the same outcomes if you're doing something different. So that's the major kind of consideration that I wanted you to be aware of. Whatever you're doing, if you're not doing what I would call a kind of classical community as method, long-term treatment, it's not wrong, but you're not likely to have the same outcomes. So it's important to decide if you're going to be in a recovery community process or recovery community project of this kind, what are you also in the recovery business, and are we using community as method the way it needs to be used in order to produce those recovery outcomes? You don't necessarily have to do that, but if you got to realize that if I'm doing something else, I may not get the same outcomes, and therefore you would still essentially continue on accepting what you're doing in whichever way you're doing it. My hope is, of course, is that you get convinced about, if you really want to get in, be part of a recovery community, then you get a better understanding of recovery, you get a better understanding of the therapeutic community, because if it's done right, it'll produce it. Now I want to go back to the other 3 points about this. We mentioned this fidelity. I gave you the outcome data. I gave you, and we just talked about these varieties of TCs. You have to recognize then that one of the real negatives has been this change in fidelity that I talk about, this decline in fidelity. That nothing runs well unless you absolutely do it as right as you can. So when you start to see outcomes, you really have to, whatever you're doing, whether you're doing a community as method or whatever treatment you're doing, you have to be able to recognize that you always have to be overseeing that it's being properly implemented and all those elements are in place and they're being practiced the way they should be practiced. It's the special issues, certainly, for even long-term residential TCs, where I've seen the community as method decline, and I'm appealing to them who still want to actually practice community as method, as I've been describing, a longer-term treatment. You're going to have to undergo a training and a retraining in order to make sure you're really what you're doing. Because we now know, after all these years, I don't want to see you suffer from the issue that you don't get the outcomes, or people don't believe the outcomes, and in fact the problem has been there's been a fidelity problem there, but yet you've been saying you think you're doing the treatment. So it's an exhortation that I hope you'll pay attention to. There are 2 other concepts on this slide. One is called a center of excellence. My best understanding over the years around these issues that I'm now talking about, how do you maintain fidelity, certainly in a long-term residential TC, that the best way to do that training is using a center of excellence. Not to go off on your own and try to put together a training curriculum and and my experience, and I'm a long-term trainer on this, my experience is it's wasteful to do that. If you really want to practice a high-powered treatment, let's say community as method, then the training has to be, you have to go to a place, you go to the best hospital in the world, you understand, to get that training. Everybody wants to get into that graduate school or get into that hospital. Of course, that's where we see the patients that we need to see, and that's where we see essentially the particular treatment that they're getting and how it's done, and you recognize and you participate in that center of excellence, both experientially, even as a staff person, and didactically, namely what's the theory and hearing, constantly, essentially the theoretical issues involved and the clinical issues involved. That's new in the world. We didn't get that in the early days. The early days, the great programs were de facto kinds of centers of excellence. People used to say, I'm a Phoenix graduate, and that got them into good positions. Or I'm a Daytop graduate, and that got them into good positions. Because the city got to understand, good things happen with these people. And people who've graduated successful TCs, long-term TCs, had credentials, you know what I mean? And but we always encourage them, then go out and get other training, get other issues, get counselor training, get all kinds of other information you want. That doesn't get in the way of you getting continual education. But for you who are educated and you want to go forward on this, consider the long-term model if you're in it, and then consider the need for the center of excellence, which is I'm encouraged that Lindsay and the group here are committed to. It could be a great contribution to the field. It's really never been done, or we have them kind of de facto, because I've been going around the world preaching this center of excellence. And there are in some areas they've done it, like in the Philippines and Asia, and preaching it in Europe, and I'm still waiting for changes there. But you have a great opportunity here in terms of what you're doing, because it sounds like the government is committed to this idea, and using a center of excellence has a uniform approach, has a standardized way of really training it, and assures it's covering all the training, major training issues. And we have new creative issues to deal with, because we have a new kind of climate now. The existence, for example, of recovery coaches and how they fit into this, and which are very, very important. I'm beginning to see really the indications of the kind of universe coming together here, and that means if we really mean it, everybody really gets the same language, same terminology, same training experiences, so you don't get any conflicts of theories and conflicts of approaches. Not that they're wrong, but they're not efficacious when you want to learn to do something right. You learn this one very well. I'll make one comment on to show the ease of which this can be done when people get confused about other approaches, like or even other treatment strategies like motivational interviewing or CBT. They're fine. They're evidence-based approaches that work. They work. And you know you always examine which populations do they work for, and you'll find out that some of them have broad application, but such evidence, so-called evidence-based practices, which are different from TC, which is also I've claimed is an evidence-based practice, but just to make this distinction, these very familiar evidence-based trauma training and CBT training and so on, they're all relevant. If the science and the clinical experience shows that they've got value, they're relevant. I always ask the question about which clients do they work for, and then the second one is, in the TCs, they'll probably work for some clients. They'll probably be of some use. TCs early on had this strange insight. They were anti-intellectual in terms of the traditional establishment medical psychiatric view, that they saw it in some diminished way. You know what I mean? And not only that, they felt that modern psychology and modern psychiatry didn't help them. And they only used physicians to get medicine, to things like that. They had a resentment around that. So it was a kind of narrowing of their own intellect. I understand that, but people like me was on the premises, and they began to change their mind. You understand, when they saw people like me can change, not them so much, but I can change. So that I came to understand what they were doing, and to the point that I can be helpful to them. Well, the evidence-based practices at those days was very informal. The great Phoenix House, for example, would have primal therapy groups. They'd bring in an expert from the outside, and they would do something as dramatic as that, primal therapy, scream therapy, or gestalt therapy, very elaborate psychology, sophisticated psychology. They'd bring it in later in treatment, around 10 months, 12 months, 14 months, have a few sessions of that or a week of that, and certain selected clients would attend that who looked at what would be appropriate. They were wide open in terms of, we'll learn anything from anybody, just bring it in. And here's the point I want you to remember, but we had to remind them and remind the world that the primary treatment approach was community as method, because they wouldn't even have a patient population who would be in there sitting receptive to it and doing it if the community didn't instill in them that they were really in a learning, training community. And so it's an evidence-based practice, but it doesn't substitute for the primary community as method. It's simply an added enhancement to them. They can now use something like a primal screen group or a gestalt group to add something to them. We were never opposed to those things, or yoga or meditation. All those, if they've proven value, they're useful, but they don't substitute for community as method. Why this is important politically, if you're a TC and you look at TC and ask what they're doing, they may say they're doing yoga, they're doing mindfulness, they've got a cafeteria of evidence-based practices, and we have a residence, and we're living together. That's not a TC, that's not community as method. It may be some kind of a healing community, and it may have some effects, but you're not going to get I haven't seen evidence of the long-term recovery effects of that at all. It's not that it's wrong, it's just probably producing different outcomes with different clients. So that's a distinction that's very important to understand, because there's a lot of TCs and a lot of governments who are funding it will prescribe what should go into that TC, in terms of as if that's the state of the art. And what is true is those practices are there, and you can use them, but that's not the state of the art of the TC. The community's method has to be understood and practiced at high fidelity, notably as a long-term approach, and then all other useful strategies can be incorporated at the right time. But if they're alone, if that's your program curriculum, you're doing something else. It's neither wrong nor right. You're doing something else, and you have to ask the question how effective it is and for whom it's effective. I hope you understand that point. That's a key. And so all of that would be covered in centers of excellence, and I hope you get committed to that idea. And this last point. The other great insight that comes out of 30, 40 years of following people through their journey and the trajectory of getting past their drug use, what we call recovery, is that we know no matter how good that program was, they got to go out into a world that's a whole new challenge. And if there's not some real continuity of what it is they've been working on and learning and changing in the TC, it's a threat to their recovery. We know the TC is powerful just from the research. Yeah, graduates are doing very well, and that's how we know. Because the major dose of treatment that you got is pretty big when you're talking about 24 months, and in some cases 36 months, of regular TC. So you saw graduates show very good rates, and even long-term dropouts show good rates. But once you start to get down under a year, you cannot assure that even people who are coming into a program and leaving in 4 months, 5 months, 6 months, forget their motivation. They may be very motivated. What the data keeps suggesting is that do they have enough of a change influence on them? And they're very optimistic about themselves, and I always wish them well. But the issue is, I have to come back to the data. I can't be a feel-good doctor to them, and tell them, that's what it's all wonderful. I got to tell them what we know about this, and I give my best shot on it. My best shot on this is that if you're doing well at 4 months or 6 months, and you have a long-term option, then you can go longer. Stay with the option. If it's a high fidelity practicing TC, and you're encouraged, you feel good at 6 months, you feel like things are going good, I can tell you this: we can already predict from years of clinical observation in TCs, the 6-month point is a heavenly point in the recovery process. It could be described very carefully as a recovery stage, which is individuals has now a sufficiently long period of time being drug-free. Means there also been brain changes physiologically, and we know that's happened. So they might be past the physiological addiction here for a while. That's very important, and that's real change. And they may be buying into the program and what their terms that they're learning and how they feel about using the techniques of the TC and what it's doing for them. That's valid. That should happen. I always saw it in a long-term program as that's a progress stage in treatment, in terms of the long-term process. Having the long-term view of recovery and where I want them to come out better prepared to deal with the world outside. A 6-month graduate is not as prepared as I would like, but it's not a sentence. I've seen people, be there for 3 or 4 months, and some of them did very well. I can see it as a kind of mystery, if you like, but they did. So I don't want to undermine that, but if it's my son or it's my family member, I'm going to say you're going to be there. If 6 months, you hit the 6-month mark, I'll tell you what the key recovery indicator is at 6 months. I've changed, I feel good, but I gotta keep changing. And I'm afraid to leave. When I hear the issues of, I'm ready to leave, I explore that with people about whether they're ready to leave, and I can understand why they're ready. Some people have a lot of attractive options when they're going to go out. They want to get their business going. They want to get back to their family. There are good reasons why they want to get out. I understand that. But I'm always not completely convinced that it's the last stop for them. And what I want for them to really appreciate, if you want to do it, you do it. But my recommendation is it's a point in your recovery, and you can get to the next stage. And that usually the commitment of the next stage is there are a lot of things I still have to work on. Not only practice what I learned in the TC, but I still have issues that I got to still address. They might be trauma issues. They might be character disorder issues. How do I still deal with authority? How do I still deal with responsibility? How do I still deal with even maybe finally, some issues of how I handle threats to my sobriety? That alone needs a reentry period that's got to be well managed. That's first stage reentry. How do you first deal with the world when you're out here? You should still be in the program while you're learning how to deal with the world when you're out here. That's the first stage of reentry. That's 12 months. But we can negotiate these time frames, but to give you the sense of the recovery process, you got to know recovery. You got to understand the stages, you got to understand the hidden threats. And then you can design what actually is, what can we do while you're still in this community and need this community, and what's pursuable when you're out there. Our endpoint is you leave. Synanon never had that endpoint. That's one of the reasons it involuted and got into trouble. That's another story. But that's the main dynamic why Synanon ultimately ran out of business, because they never believed in reentry. They never believed in reintegration. Their issue was you had to stay in Synanon forever. So that was a variation on once a junkie, always a junkie. So the issue for you is we want people to leave, but we want them to be at a certain stage of recovery when they're now ready to challenge the world, and that's a measurable, accessible stage. That has to do with what you're seeing here is recovery-oriented graded systems. A real system means we've got linked stop points where people can go and what they have to do to advance their recovery. You do 12 months here, and then you do 3 months here, and then you do 1 month doing this. There's a kind of prescribed pathway that each step of the way is you're dealing with new levels of your own recovery issues, and you're still in community, and you're still able to deal with it in a productive way. That, to me, is the idealized recovery community. It's a linked system of like-minded providers and residents. And so we know what we're doing, and we even have a methodology for how to do it. I call that a recovery-oriented integrated system. Integrated means the key recovery linkage is the word recovery. We all know what we're trying to achieve, and we have many of the same methodological tools at hand to produce those outcomes. They don't all have to be done in residential treatment. That's only a particular setting for accomplishing a particular goal, a stable goal in that recovery stage process. The advertisement is the video on 10 stages of recovery. I don't know if I mentioned it earlier, but you should, if you get an opportunity, you can probably pull it up. So it's 10 stages of recovery, and it's a clinical video. It describes each stage. I talk about each stage in a little bit more detail, and how it basically is the basis of assessing recovery over time. And you can see it for yourself clinically. So those two concepts, Centers of Excellence and Recovery, Royce, I hope will be fully matured in your project. I don't know who we have to convince on that. But I can tell you, if you're doing something that the world hasn't really done yet. And if you do it, you'll change the world.